My name is Emily Carter, and when the lawyer read my father's will in front of my entire family, I discovered a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. For 26 years, I believed my father was just a hardworking mechanic who struggled to provide for our family. But sitting in that law office, I learned that David Carter had been living a double life, and that the man who could barely afford my college tuition had secretly accumulated $2.3 million. I was sitting there still processing the shock of inheriting money I never knew existed when the lawyer handed me a sealed letter that revealed an even bigger secret. My father had been supporting 3 other families across the state, and I had siblings I'd never met. The silence in that room was deafening as my mother and brother realized that the man they thought they knew had been a complete stranger. If you're watching this, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story gets absolutely mind-blowing. Drop in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know where my fellow family secret survivors are. This is my story about how a will reading revealed that my entire childhood was built on lies, and how I had to decide what to do with the truth about a father who was nothing like the man I thought I knew. Growing up in Millfield, Ohio, my father, David Carter, was known as the guy who could fix anything. He owned a small auto repair shop on Main Street, worked 6 days a week, and came home every night with grease under his fingernails and stories about the cars he'd worked on that day. Our family wasn't poor, but we weren't wealthy either. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house that my parents had bought in 1995 with a 30-year mortgage. My mother, Linda, worked part-time as a school secretary to help make ends meet. My younger brother, Jake, and I wore hand-me-downs, shopped at thrift stores, and learned early that money was something you had to be careful with. Your father works harder than any man I know. My mother would tell us when we complained about not having the latest toys or brand-name clothes. He's doing everything he can to provide for this family. Dad was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He never missed one of Jake's baseball games, even when it meant closing the shop early and losing money. He helped me with my homework every night at the kitchen table, patiently explaining math problems, even though he'd only finished high school himself. When it came time for college, the financial reality hit hard. I qualified for some financial aid, but my parents still had to take out loans to cover the remaining costs. I remember my father sitting at that same kitchen table, going through paperwork with a worried expression. "We'll make it work, sweetheart." He told me, "Your education is worth whatever it cost." I felt guilty about the financial burden my college education was placing on my family. I worked part-time jobs throughout school and graduated with a degree in nursing, determined to pay back my parents for their sacrifice. After graduation, I moved back home to save money while working at the local hospital. My father seemed proud of my career choice, often telling customers at the shop that his daughter was a nurse who helped save lives. "That's my Emily," he would say with genuine pride. "She's the smart one in the family." Everything about our family dynamic seemed normal, loving, and honest. There was no reason to suspect that my father was hiding anything from us. My father's death came without warning. He had a massive heart attack at the shop on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Jake found him when he stopped by after school to help with some inventory. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. The funeral was packed with people from our small town. Customers whose cars he had fixed, neighbors he had helped with various projects, and friends from the local diner where he ate lunch every day. Everyone had stories about my father's kindness, his reliability, and his dedication to his family. "Your dad fixed my car for free when I was laid off," one customer told me at the funeral. "He said everyone deserves reliable transportation to look for work. Dave helped me move 3 times and never asked for anything in return," a neighbor shared. He was the kind of man who showed up when you needed him. These stories reinforced everything I believed about my father, that he was a good man who worked hard and cared about his community. In the weeks following the funeral, my mother, Jake, and I began the difficult process of settling his affairs. We expected it to be straightforward. The house, the shop, maybe a small life insurance policy, and probably some debt that we'd have to figure out how to handle. My mother had been handling the household finances for years, but my father had always managed the business accounts. When we went through his desk at the shop, we found the usual paperwork, invoices, receipts, supplier information, but nothing that seemed unusual or complicated. Dad was always so organized, Jake said as we sorted through files. Everything's labeled and filed exactly where you'd expect it to be. The lawyer my mother contacted, Mr. Patterson, had handled my parents' wills years earlier. He scheduled a meeting for the following week to go over my father's estate and help us understand what needed to be done. It should be fairly simple, Mr. Patterson told my mother over the phone. Your husband updated his will about 2 years ago, so everything should be current. None of us expected anything complicated. We were just a working-class family dealing with the loss of our provider and trying to figure out how to move forward financially. The meeting at Mr. Patterson's office was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. My mother, Jake, and I sat in the small conference room, expecting to hear about modest assets and maybe some debt we'd need to manage. Mr. Patterson seemed unusually formal as he opened my father's file. Before we begin, he said, looking at each of us carefully, I want you to know that your father's estate is more complex than you might expect. Complex how? My mother asked. Dave was a simple man with a simple business. Mr. Patterson opened the will and began reading the standard legal language, but then he got to the assets section. What he read next made no sense to any of us. David Carter leaves the following to his wife, Linda: the family home, valued at $180,000 and $50,000, from his primary savings account. To his son, Jake, $75,000 for college expenses and future endeavors. To his daughter, Emily, the auto repair business, valued at approximately $120,000, and the remainder of his estate. What remainder? I asked, confused. Mr. Patterson looked up. From the document, Emily, your father had multiple bank accounts, investment portfolios, and real estate holdings that total approximately $2.3 million. The room went silent. My mother's face went completely pale. That's impossible, she whispered. Dave barely made enough to cover our bills. We took out loans for Emily's college. We've been living paycheck to paycheck for years. According to these documents, Mr. Patterson continued, your husband has been making substantial deposits into various accounts for over 15 years. The money appears to come from sources beyond the auto repair shop. What sources? Jake asked. That's where things become more complicated, Mr. Patterson said. Your father left specific instructions that Emily should receive a sealed letter that explains the origin of these assets. He handed me an envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in my father's careful handwriting. As I read it aloud to my mother and Jake, our understanding of David Carter completely unraveled. My dear Emily, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're learning about parts of my life that I kept hidden from our family. I need you to understand that everything I did was motivated by love, but I know that doesn't excuse the deception. The letter went on to explain that my father had been living a double life for over 20 years. In addition to our family, he had been supporting 3 other women and their children in different parts of Ohio. He had relationships with these women that predated his marriage to my mother, but he had never ended them. I know this will be devastating to learn, he wrote, but I couldn't abandon these women and children who depended on me. Sarah in Columbus has 2 children, ages 14 and 16. Maria in Toledo has a 12-year-old daughter. Jennifer in Akron has a 19-year-old son who just started college. My mother was crying silently as I continued reading. The money came from a side business I ran, buying and selling classic cars that I would restore in a warehouse outside of town. I never told your mother about this business because I was using the profits to support these other families. I know this makes me a liar and a cheat, but I couldn't let any of these children suffer. The letter included addresses and phone numbers for the 3 women, along with instructions for how to contact them. My father had left specific amounts of money for each family, but he had made me the executor of his estate, responsible for distributing the funds and deciding how much contact to have with these other families. Emily, I'm asking you to handle this because you have the strongest moral compass of anyone I know, the letter continued. I trust you to do what's right for everyone involved, including your mother and Jake, who are innocent victims of my choices. The final paragraph was the most heartbreaking. I know I don't deserve forgiveness for the lies I've told and the double life I've lived, but I want you to know that my love for you, Jake, and your mother was never fake. You were always my first family, my real family, even when I was failing to be the man you deserved. When I finished reading, the three of us sat in complete silence for several minutes. Everything we thought we knew about our family, our father, and our financial situation had been completely false. The drive home from the lawyer's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. None of us spoke. My mother stared out the window. Jake kept shaking his head in disbelief. And I tried to process the fact that I now had 3 half-siblings I never met and $2.3 million I never expected. When we got home, my mother went straight to her bedroom and closed the door. Jake and I sat in the living room, looking at each other with no idea what to say. Did you have any idea? Jake asked finally. None, I replied. Did you ever notice anything weird about Dad's schedule or behavior? He traveled sometimes for car parts, Jake said slowly, and he worked late a lot. But I just thought that was normal for running a business. We spent the evening going through family photos and memories, trying to find clues we had missed. But my father had been incredibly careful about maintaining his double life. There were no suspicious phone calls, no unexplained absences, no evidence that would have made us question his story. He was living 4 different lives, I said to Jake. How do you even manage that logistically? And emotionally, Jake added. How do you look your wife and kids in the eye every day while hiding something this big? The hardest part was realizing that our financial struggles had been unnecessary. While my mother worked part-time to help pay bills, while I took out student loans for college, while we shopped at thrift stores and worried about money, my father had been sitting on millions of dollars. I feel so stupid, my mother said when she finally came out of her room that evening. 26 years of marriage, and I never suspected anything. You're not stupid, Mom, I told her. Dad was deliberately deceiving all of us. This isn't your fault. But I could see the self-doubt and humiliation in her eyes. She was questioning every conversation, every decision, every moment of their marriage. After a week of processing the initial shock, I decided I needed to contact the 3 women my father had mentioned in his letter. I felt a responsibility to let them know about his death and to understand the full scope of his deception. The first call I made was to Sarah in Columbus. When I explained who I was and why I was calling, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. David had a wife and children? She asked, her voice shaking. He told me he was divorced. He said his ex-wife had custody of his kids and didn't want him involved in their lives. He was never divorced, I told her gently. My parents were married for 26 years. Sarah broke down crying. She had been in a relationship with my father for 18 years, believing that she was his partner and that her children were his only kids. She had no idea about our family or the other women. The conversation with Maria in Toledo was similar. She had been with my father for 15 years and thought she was his only relationship. Her daughter called him daddy and had no idea she had. Siblings Jennifer in Akron had the most shocking revelation. She'd been with my father the longest, 22 years, and had actually met him before he married my mother. She thought my mother was the other woman who had broken up their relationship. David told me he had to marry Linda for business reasons, Jennifer explained. He said it was temporary and that he would leave her once he got his finances sorted out. That was 26 years ago. Each conversation was heartbreaking. These women had built their lives around relationships they thought were real, and their children had grown up believing my father was their devoted partner and parent. None of them knew about the others. How many of us are there? Sarah asked. During our second conversation, Are you sure it's just the 4 families? I honestly didn't know. My father's letter had mentioned 3 other families, but given the scope of his deception, there could have been more. The process of distributing my father's estate took 6 months. I worked with Mr. Patterson to ensure that each family received the money my father had designated for them, plus additional support for the children's education expenses. The hardest decision was whether to arrange meetings between the families. The children, my half-siblings, were curious about each other, but the mothers were dealing with their own grief and betrayal. Eventually, we organized a gathering at a neutral location in Columbus. It was awkward and emotional, but also healing. In some ways, the children got to meet each other, and we all got to share stories about the man we thought we knew. Your dad used to help me with my math homework every Tuesday, my half-sister Emma told me. He said education was the most important thing. He taught me how to change a tire when I turned 16, my half-brother Marcus shared. He said every person should know how to take care of their car. These stories were both comforting and painful. My father had been a good parent to all of his children, but he had done it through lies and deception that hurt everyone involved. My mother struggled the most with forgiveness. She felt betrayed not just by the affairs, but by the financial deception that had caused unnecessary hardship for our family. I worked part-time for 20 years because I thought we needed the money, she told me. I worried about every expense while he was sitting on millions. I know, Mom, I said, but holding on to anger isn't going to change what happened. For me, the decision to forgive came gradually. I realized that my father's love for me had been real, even if his honesty hadn't been. He had made terrible choices that hurt multiple families, but he had also tried to take care of everyone he felt responsible for. I used part of my inheritance to pay off my student loans and help my mother retire comfortably. I also established college funds for my half-siblings and maintained relationships with them despite the complicated circumstances of how we met. The experience taught me that people are capable of being both deeply flawed and genuinely loving. At the same time, my father wasn't the simple, honest man I thought he was, but he also wasn't a villain. He was a human being who made choices that created pain for everyone involved, including himself. I think Dad lived with the weight of these secrets every day. I told Jake during one of our conversations about the situation. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps me understand why he seemed so tired all the time. If you've ever discovered that someone you loved wasn't who you thought they were, know that it's possible to hold both disappointment and love in your heart at the same time. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the people who loved us most, even if they showed it in imperfect ways. Leave in the comments if you've ever learned shocking family secrets that changed your perspective on someone you loved. And if this story helped you think about forgiveness in a new way, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the complexity of human relationships. Remember, the truth about people is usually more complicated than we expect, and healing often requires accepting that complexity rather than demanding simple answers.